Hello, and welcome to Historical Humans Read, where we take primary sources and bring them to your screen. I'm Colum Coleman, and today we are reading from Democracy, an American novel by Henry Brooks Adams. Originally published anonymously in 1880, Democracy was an instant bestseller. It was not until 7 years after Adams' death that his publisher revealed the author's name for the 1925 reprint. Democracy is a political novel on the abuse of power in America that follows the inauguration and term of a fictional U.S. president through the eyes of a young widow pursued by a powerful U.S. senator. Cynical in its realism, Democracy demonstrates corruption as inextricably linked to political ambition, with the concepts of public good and virtue revealed to be little more than the ruse of the powerful. Today we will be reading from Chapter 1 of Democracy, an American Novel. With that, let's begin. For reasons which many persons thought ridiculous, Mrs. Lightfoot Lee decided to pass the winter in Washington. She was in excellent health, but she said that the climate would do her good. In New York, she had troops of friends, but she suddenly became eager to see again the very small number of those who lived on the Potomac. It was only her closest intimates that she honestly acknowledged herself to be tortured by the ennui. Since her husband's death 5 years before, she had lost her taste for New York society. She had felt no interest in the price of stocks and very little in the men who dealt in them. She had become serious. What was it all worth, this wilderness of men and women, as monotonous as the brown stone houses they lived in? In her despair, she had resorted to desperate measures. She had read philosophy in the original German. And the more she read, the more disheartened she was that so much culture should lead to nothing. Nothing. After talking of Herbert Spencer for an entire evening with a very literary transcendental commission merchant, she could not see that her time had been better employed than when in former days she had passed it in flirting with a very agreeable young stockbroker. Indeed, there was an evident proof to the contrary, for the flirtation might lead to something, had, in fact, led to marriage, while the philosophy could lead to nothing, unless it were perhaps to another evening of the same kind, because transcendental philosophers are mostly elderly men, usually married, and, when engaged in business, somewhat apt to be sleepy towards evening. Nevertheless, Mrs. Lee did her best to turn her study to practical use. She plunged into philanthropy, visited prisons, inspected hospitals, read the literature of pauperism and crime, saturated herself with the statistics of vice until her mind had nearly lost sight of virtue. At last, it rose in rebellion against her, and she came to the limit of her strength. This path, too, seemed to lead nowhere. She declared that she had lost the sense of duty, and that, so far as concerned her, all the paupers and criminals in New York might henceforth rise in their majesty and manage every railway on the continent. Why should she care? What was the city to her? She could find nothing in it that seemed to demand salvation. What gave peculiar sanctity to numbers? Why were there a million, who all resembled each other, any way more interesting than one person? What aspiration could she help to put into the mind of this great million-armed monster that would make it worth her love or respect? Religion? 1,000 powerful churches were doing their best, and she could see no chance for a new faith of which she was to be the inspired prophet. Ambition, high popular ideals, passion for whatever is lofty and pure. The very words irritated her. Was she not herself devoured by ambition, Was she not now eating her heart out because she could find no object of worth to sacrifice? Was it ambition, real ambition? Or was it mere restlessness that made Mrs. Lightfoot Lee so bitter against New York and Philadelphia, Baltimore and Boston, American life in general, and all life in particular? What did she want? Not social position, for she herself was an eminently respectable Philadelphian by birth, her father a famous clergyman, and her husband had been equally irreproachable, a descendant of one branch of the Virginia Lees, which had drifted to New York in search of fortune and had found it, or enough of it, to keep the young man there. His widow had her own place in society which no one disputed. Though not brighter than her neighbors, the world persisted in classing her among clever women. She had wealth, or at least enough of it to give her all the money can give by way of pleasure to a sensible woman in an American city. She had her house and her carriage. She dressed well. Her table was good, and her furniture never allowed to fall behind the latest standard of decorative art. She had traveled in Europe, and after several visits, covering some years of time, had returned home, carrying in one hand, as it were, a green-gray landscape, a remarkable, pleasing specimen of Corot, and in the other some bales of Persian and Syrian rugs and embroideries, Japanese bronzes and porcelain. With this she declared Europe to be exhausted, and she frankly avowed that she was American to the tips of her fingers. She neither knew nor greatly cared whether America or Europe was best to live in. She had no violent love for either, and she had no objection to abusing both. But she meant to get all that American life had to offer, good or bad, and drink it down to the dregs, fully determined that whatever there was in it she would have, and that whatever could be made out of it she would manufacture. I know, she said, that America produces petroleum and pigs. I have seen both on the steamers. And I am told it produces silver and gold. There is choice enough for any woman. Yet, as has already been said, Mrs. Lee's first experience was not a success. She soon declared that New York might represent the petroleum or the pigs, but the gold of life was not to be discovered there by her eyes. Not but that there was variety enough, variety of people, occupations, aims, and thoughts, but that all these, after growing to a certain height, stopped short. They found nothing to hold them up. She knew, more or less intimately, a dozen men whose fortunes ranged between 1 million and 40 millions. What did they do with their money? What could they do with it that was different from what other men did? After all, it is absurd to spend more money than is enough to satisfy one's wants. It is vulgar to live in 2 houses on the same street and to drive 6 horses abreast. Yet, after setting aside a certain income sufficient for all one's wants, what was to be done with the rest? To let it accumulate was to own one's failure. Mrs. Lee's great grievance was that it did accumulate without changing or improving the quality of its owners. To spend it in charity and public works was doubtlessly praiseworthy, but was it wise? Mrs. Lee had read enough political economy and pauper reports to be nearly convinced that public work should be public duty, and that great benefactions do harm as well as good. And even supposing it spent on these objects, how could it do more than increase and perpetuate that same kind of human nature, which was her great grievance? Her New York friends could not meet this question except by falling back upon their native commonplaces, which she recklessly trampled upon, averring that, much as she admired the genius of the famous traveler Mr. Gulliver, she had never been able, since she had become a widow, to accept the Brobdingnagian doctrine that he who made 2 blades of grass grow where only one grew before deserved better of mankind than the whole race of politicians. She would not find fault with the philosopher that he required that grass should be of an improved quality. But, said she, I cannot honestly pretend that I should be pleased to see 2 New York men where I now see 1. The idea is too ridiculous. More than 1.5 would be fatal to me. This has been an excerpt from Democracy, an American novel on historical humans reads. If you enjoyed this video and would like to hear more excerpts from original texts, please subscribe to be notified of the next one. If there is a work you would like to hear, be sure to like the video and leave a comment listing it below. Thank you for listening.